and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I'm so glad to have you. I hope you're doing well. I will explain why the series exists in just a brief moment. Before I do that, today I'm going to talk about Next to Normal, which has literally every single content warning imaginable because that's how theater likes to handle mental illness, but specifically content warning for medical trauma, death, grief, and Slooey slide. So if you want to learn about disability in theater without hearing about those topics, I have at this point 10 other disability dramaturgy videos to offer, and I think How to Dance in Ohio, Wicked, and Hunchback may be the only three that don't include those topics. And sort of Sweeney Todd, but also that one's very murder heavy. But either way, you can go watch any of those instead of this one if you want. That is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with knowing your limits. I have my playlist of all those deep dives at the top of my sources, so you can go check those out if you want. And also, as always, I'll keep the triggering content to a minimum, because if we don't need to talk about it directly, we're not going to. Great, amazing. Hi, I'm Sydney. I'm multi-hyphenate a lot of things. For the purposes of this video, I'm an actor, disability dramaturg, and have a specific focus in accessible education, media analysis, and accessible theater. Mostly, I kind of follow what seems interesting and I learn skills on the fly, because isn't that just the autistic way? Also, for friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it, and I'm wearing a white shirt with gray stripes that are horizontal stripes and a orange burnt sienna. Yeah, dark orange open button up on top that's 3/4 sleeve. This is yet again a reminder that I need to go back to doing shows that have like a fun cosplay option, because that's half the fun of these, but I also am not doing any of those until at least October, so that's sad. Anyway, the point of the series is to academically prove that disabled characters and disabled stories have always been a part of the theater canon and always will be, learn a little bit of critical thinking and media analysis skills, and talk about ways to ethically stage already existing shows that include disability, if that's even possible. Sometimes it's not. We are never here to call anybody ableist or critique any specific performers or creators in any capacity. The issue has been and always will be the ableism of the industry itself, which is just a specific refraction of the ableism in the entire universe. Like, these ideas are not arts industry specific. They're curated in a very specific way because of how the arts industry views disability, particularly mental disability, which we're gonna get to that concept a little bit later. But we're not here to like judge anybody or critique anybody. We're here to critique the piece itself. These videos are always for an educational cool that happened now what purpose, and those purposes only. And I say this because I learned a few months ago that people involved in the creation of these shows sometimes watch these videos, which is both cool and absolutely terrifying. But hi, you're incredible. Literally none of this is personal. In fact, what I've learned from this series and my media analysis series in general is that it's better to quit while I'm ahead, and I've shelved all of my disability-related creative ideas indefinitely, because editing and executing other people's ideas is a lot less terrifying. So much appreciation for your skill and talent. I simply could never. What are the other things that I need to be saying here? Oh, I talk really fast. If that is an issue, that's how I speak. But you can change the speed of watching the video on the bottom right corner next to where the captions are, and also a hand caption everything, so you can turn those on if that's helpful for you, and it also offers a transcript if that is also helpful for you, because access needs are important. Now, as always, we're going to start with going through the plot, so spoilers. And then we're going to talk about the history of the show. We will not be playing adaptation bingo today because Next Normal is an original musical, and there have been no non-stage adaptations since then, other than the legendary Twitter thread, which seems to have been scrubbed from the internet. So we're going straight into disability narratives. No adaptation bingo this week, I'm so sorry. Followed by ethical staging and what do we do with this piece of media in a modern context discussion. I'm stoked. I hope you're stoked. Let's get into it. So, Next Normal is a 2008 rock musical written by Brian Yorkey and Tom Kitt, who you may also recognize as the writers of If Then and Freaky Friday the musical, and it has quite the cult following. Like, quite the cult following. I feel like I missed the era of my life when I was supposed to become obsessed with this show. I never had it, and I feel left out almost. And rather than badly explain to you what it's about, we're just gonna jump right into the plot. Also, I should note that this show is heavily inspired by Rent and Tommy, and if you've seen my Tommy video, you'll see those parallels very clearly throughout this. Now, the show opens on a woman named Diana who waited up until 4 in the morning for her son Gabe to get home because he has once again broken curfew, and they get into an argument where she's like, I was so worried about you, and he's like, you need to chill. I'm almost 18, Mom. Just relax. But she keeps on with her motherly scolding, as mothers do. Then her husband Dan enters, and she tells Gabe to sneak up the back way to his room, and she tells her husband that she was just talking to herself, and she'll be up to bed in a minute, and he's like, okay. And then Natalie, their daughter, shows up drinking a Red Bull, and she's like, yeah, no, I'm fine. I just have like 6 hours of homework to do, but it's like totally fine. I'm totally fine. Don't worry about it. I'm totally good. And her mother's like, you you need to take a break. You need to relax and you need to take a break. And then this turns into a song where the whole family sings about how they're barely holding it together, but they're trying to pretend that they're fine. And then we see them all get ready for the day. They have breakfast and Diana starts to make a bunch of sandwiches for everybody on the table, but then she keeps making more and more sandwiches, and then she moves the bread slices to the chairs and then to the floor, and she gets really stuck in what she's doing until Dan leans down and he's like, honey? Is everything okay? And she's like, oh, everything's fine. I'm just making sandwiches on the floor. You go on ahead. You'll miss the bus. So the kids leave, and Diana's like, I just wanted to get ahead on lunches. I guess I got carried away. And he's like, okay, honey, I'm gonna bring you to the doctor. Now we cut to Natalie in a practice room at her school playing piano and singing a song about how Mozart was crazy, but his music makes a lot of sense, and that it takes you away from the world where you're so focused on achieving enough to get into the perfect college so you can escape your family at the earliest possibility, and she kind of goes in a little mental spiral there. And then we meet Henry, who's another kid at her school, and he comes into the practice room to listen to her play. We then cut to the doctor's office where Dr. Fine is telling Diana about the complicated medication regimen that she needs to be on, and it's super confusing and complicated and impossible to keep track of or understand. At the same time, we see Dan either sitting in his car or in the waiting room, I think it's in the car, wondering who is crazier, the one who's getting the treatment or the one who's continuing to hope that maybe she'll get better, and being frustrated at how little she is able to do anymore. And then she sings about how her psychopharmacologist knows her every last secret and she knows nothing other than his name. At this point, we get to hear her diagnosis, which is bipolar depressive with delusional episodes, which via the DSM-5 would be the equivalent of bipolar with psychotic features. We'll talk about the diagnostic situation in a little bit. We also learn that she has a 16-year medication history, and we learn that she has tons of side effects from all of these medications, which is frustrating to her, and the doctor says that they'll just try again, and eventually they'll get it right, to which she says, it's not a very exact science, is it? The continuation of this appointment is intercut with Natalie and Henry arguing about jazz, him being very pro-jazz and her being very pro-structure, and then these two scenes kind of continue back and forth with each other until Diana says she doesn't feel like herself anymore, she doesn't feel anything, and the doctor says, great, patient stable. The next scene is between Henry and Natalie, where he gets stoned and they sing about how the world is absolutely terrible, but in the middle of like the existence of global warming and pandemics and wars and genocides and everything, they love each other. And then they kiss. And then Henry asks if he can come into her house, and she says, absolutely not, and then he leaves. Meanwhile, Diana was watching this happen from the window, and Gabe is like, are you spying on your own kid? And she's like, when did she get a boyfriend? I totally missed that. And he's like, well, you kind of miss a lot. And then we cut to the memory of a young Dan proposing to a young Diana after they accidentally got pregnant with Gabe, to sort of parallel between the couple that they once were, as reflected in Natalie and Henry, versus the couple that they could that Natalie and Henry could become as Dan and Diana. This then transitions into I Missed the Mountains, a song where Diana sings about how she feels like she's missing out on life by not feeling the highs and lows the way that she used to, and not being fully present for other life moments, and so she flushes all of her pills down the toilet, with Gabe telling her that that's a really great idea and it's a very brave choice. And then the following song is Dan going on and on and on about how suddenly Diana's doing so much better, and everything's great, and it's wonderful, and he's so happy, and he's so excited, and everything is just fantastic. Meanwhile, Diana's like, I cleaned absolutely everything, I rewired the computer, and now I'm gonna retile the roof. And I'm not sure why Dan is not noticing that this is clearly a manic episode, but I guess he wanted so badly for her to get better that he just doesn't think twice about it, but this is a bizarre plot point to me. Anyway, then Henry finally comes in to have a family dinner with all of them, and everything seems really great and good and fine and happy family until Diana walks out with a birthday cake for Gabe. And this is when we learn that Gabe actually died before Natalie was born, and the Gabe that we've been seeing throughout this entire show thus far has been merely a hallucination. And then Dan and Diana have a fight where he basically says, I'm here to help you, can you please work with me and let me help you? And hallucination Gabe tries to get his attention, and Diana's like, you don't know how to help me, can you please just go away? And then we see Natalie and Henry talking, and she's saying Superboy and Invisible Girl about how her mom is so focused on Gabe while completely ignoring her, and she wishes she could just get away from that house. And Diana's like, you know that's not true, I love you as much as I can, which, whew, that's a line. And then at the end of this number, Natalie smokes weed for the first time. Then we go back to the waiting room, and Dan says that they're going to find her a doctor who can treat her without medication, and this new psychotherapist is supposed to be really, really great. And he specifically says Dr. Madden is supposed to be a real rock star. And so Diana ends up hallucinating that he is in fact an actual, literal rock star during this appointment. So they get to know each other. He talks about how bipolar is often triggered by a traumatic event, and they talk about whether she's ever actually felt happy, and then they talk about Gabe, and the two of them work very closely together 4 times a week, and he does hypnosis therapy with her that seems to be making significant progress. And also at the same time this is happening, Natalie is like, she's never gonna get better, is she? And Dan says he doesn't know, and then Natalie starts to steal her mom's pills and abuse them, and we also see Gabe becoming more menacing and negative, kind of like the embodiment of Diana's depression and negative thoughts. Now cut to Natalie. She's preparing for a big recital and being nervous that her parents aren't there, and she ends up having a sort of breakdown on stage where she rants about classical music and jazz. Meanwhile, Diana agrees that she wants to let her son go and be there for Natalie more, so she goes home and she takes out a box of Gabe's baby things to get rid of them to help let him go. She then pulls out a music box from this box and she begins to dance to the song played by the music box, along with her hallucination of Gabe. And while this dance continues, we hear Dr. Madden say her name and that she was discovered unconscious at home after trying to take her own life. He then suggests to Dan that she should do ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, as her best bet for treatment at this point. And it's framed in a way where we know factually that he's right. In this moment, it's kind of her only option, but at the same time, he seems like he's sort of pushing Dan into making this choice that he's reluctant to make. And then Dan sings a song while cleaning up her blood about how hard it is to be by her side throughout this, and also is somewhat frustrated at her for trying to leave him behind. Then Natalie gets home and learns about ECT and is super aggressively against it and is angry at her dad for pushing it on her mom, as is hallucination Gabe, who says it causes brain damage, while Dr. Madden says it could cause some minor memory issues. And then Diana sings about how she's seen all of the various villainized portrayals of electroconvulsive therapy in the movies and she doesn't want to do this. And Dan is like, it's gonna be fine. You need to do this in order to get better. And so she ends up signing the consent form and gets taken into the treatment room, and then bam, it's intermission. Great! Act 2. It starts with a song called Wish I Were Here, where Henry finds Natalie partying at a club on truly so many pills for the 5th night in a row, which is then paralleled by Diana going through the ECT, both of them wishing that they were present, but at the same time both relying on artificial things to keep them going. Henry takes Natalie home, and Dan takes Diana home, and Diana doesn't recognize Natalie or the house, and they discover that Diana has seemingly had complete amnesia from this treatment. And then Natalie avoids Henry, and Henry keeps going after her, saying like, I'm really worried about you, and can you at least please go to the dance with me? And she ends up declining. Dr. Madden tells them that the memory loss can be a side effect of the treatment, but usually it comes back in pieces, and actually that memory loss helps as part of her treatment to clear her head, and that Dan needs to just slowly help her get these memories back with photos and things, and slowly and carefully explain what's going on, but very slowly so she doesn't get too overwhelmed and then relapse. Dan shows her a sanitized version of their lives, and she doesn't quite connect to it. And then Natalie gets frustrated and shows her photos of things she did when she was struggling with her madness, and Diana remembers those pieces very clearly and somewhat apologizes for that behavior. We then see the Gabe hallucination reappear, singing to Diana about how the doctors have killed him again by clearing him from her memory, but Diana just can't hear him. Meanwhile, she's trying to figure out what's missing because she keeps feeling like she's missing some really important part of her memory. Natalie turns Henry down for the dance again. Diana is still frustrated that she's missing things, and so her doctor tells her to go talk to her husband, and she gets frustrated at him, reasonably, and then Dr. Madden asks her like, has Dan brought up your son? And she goes, my what? And then she leaves. And then we see her go home and she opens the music box again, and Dan is terrified that she's going to relapse, but they sing together about how Gabe died. Basically, he'd been sick with something for a bit when he was a baby, but the doctors missed it, and by then it was too late. And then Dan's like, we should call Dr. Madden. And she's like, why would we call the doctor? I'm fine. I literally just want to understand what happened. Can you please tell me what our son's name was? Why don't you ever say it? And Dan's like, it's gonna be fine. We're gonna bring you back to the doctor. We're gonna get you more treatment, and it's gonna be totally fine. And she keeps asking him just like, oh my gosh, can you please say our child's name? During this argument, Henry shows up for the dance and Natalie goes to meet up with him, but then they're both focused on the parents arguing, and then Dan takes the music box and throws it on the ground, and Natalie yells at him and runs back to her room, followed by Henry. Next is a song that Diana and Natalie both sing to their respective partners, saying like, why bother stay with me, because you're probably better off not dealing with my issues, and they're both like, because I promised that I would be there for you, and that is why I stay. And then Gabe appears, and Diana sees him this time, and he's like, I'm alive, and you can't tame me until you're willing to actually say what my name is and acknowledge that I'm alive. This song is a bop. And then Natalie tells Henry that she can't go to the dance because she has to take her mom to the doctor, and Henry offers to drive and she refuses, and he says he wants to help and she says no, and she makes him leave, saying she'll try to come to the dance later. And then Diana sings to Dr. Madden, who's like, I mean, relapse happens. And she's like, yeah, but maybe it's my soul that's broken rather than my brain, and maybe that's why things aren't actually getting better. And Dr. Madden is like, this is some semblance of clarity, and you need to keep working on thinking this through, and unfortunately bipolar is a chronic illness and you're going to constantly be living with it, and you need to continue to fight with it. And like, you're still gonna need therapy and you're still gonna have a lot of work to do, but you're on the right track and you need to keep trying to treat it. You just can't give up. And she's like, okay, well, why does the DSM say that grief that continues past a certain time frame is considered pathological and needs to be medicated, and who gets to choose how long grief is allowed to last? And he says, well, it's merely a guideline, and that medicine as a field isn't magic, it's not perfect, but it's the best they've got for right now, and she needs to learn to work with it. And she walks out the door. And then she and Natalie have a deep moment where she's like, maybe I finally truly lost it and I'm playing with fire, who knows, but I'm tired of struggling all the time. And I know that you, Natalie, probably feel the same way too. And Natalie's like, cool, but I've already grieved whatever this is, and this feels like a little bit too little too late. And Diana's like, well, maybe it'll never be perfectly okay, but can we please let go of the past and just try to be something that's next to normal? And then she tells her Gabe died of an intestinal obstruction at 8 months old, and she was never able to really say that to her before, and then she brings her to the dance. At the dance, Henry and Natalie meet, and they talk, and he says he'll always be there for her, and she starts to panic about how he says that now, but what if she goes crazy? What then? Like, will he stay by her side? And he says, that's fine. Messy is fine with him. He loves her anyway. And then they kiss. Then Diana tells Dan that she's leaving him because she needs to get out of the situation in order to figure out what's up and what's down and sort everything out for herself. And on the way out, she nods at Gabe, who watches her leave, and Gabe then goes up to Dan and sort of haunts him a little bit, and Dan tries to shake him off, but he says he can't go until Dan acknowledges him, and finally he does acknowledge him, and then Gabe leaves. Then Natalie comes home and she's like, Dad, why are you sitting in the dark? And then they sing about how they need some light, which then turns into singing about how the hard things never go away, but we still go on and we find a way to survive and be happy with life anyway. We learn that Diana went to live with her parents for the time being, and Dan agrees to start therapy, and they all sing about how the price of love is loss, and there will always be light at the end of the hard times, and that is our show. The show originally began its life in 1998 as a 10-minute musical sketch titled Feeling Electric that was Yorkie and Kit's final project at the BMI Lehman Engel Musical Theater Workshop, and this version centered around a woman who was going through ECT and its impact on the family around her. As they worked on other projects, they kept coming back to this one, and they eventually expanded it to a full musical, which had its very first readings in 2002, followed by a 2005 workshop, and then in September of that year, they ran the show at the New York Musical Theater Festival, at which point producer David Stone picked it up and brought in director Michael Greif, whose name you may remember because he also directed Dear Evan Hansen, which we talked about 2 months ago, and he also directed Rent. And the two of them felt like the show needed to be focused less on ideas and like critiquing the medical establishment and more on people and a specific family's pain as a result of the mother's mental illness, so the show headed in that direction, and they changed their name from Feeling Electric to Next to Normal. It played off-Broadway at Second Stage from January to March of 2008 to generally mixed reviews with critiques about how it was internally confused and that the comedic aspects and the emotional aspects weren't quite balanced right. The show then ran at the temporary location at the time for the Arena Stage from November 2008 to January 2009, and then it moved to Broadway at the Booth Theater, where it opened on April 16th, 2009 and ran until January of 2011. It ended up setting 2 different box office records for this theater and opened to generally positive reviews, though there were still some critiques of how the show handled its specific subject matter, particularly with how it treats the medical system and the efficacy of various treatments, but we'll get to that. Overall, it was a hit, being one of the, if not the, I could honestly argue in either direction, first mainstream musicals to discuss mental health issues, and specifically the first to talk about them in a more medicalized way. It is also very rare for musicals to tackle issues of family dysfunction in this manner, because there are like generally understood narrative norms that are more typical for plays versus typical for musicals, and this show has more of a play feel. So it brought a whole lot of new things to musical theater that musical theater hadn't really seen before, quickly gaining it a cult following. This does not mean that it didn't have a ton of issues, many of which had been openly discussed at the time, but we will get to that. It also doesn't entirely explain to me why I'm not seeing many critiques of the current London revival of this show, but I have a feeling that these critiques will probably appear more strongly if it were to transfer to Broadway. But the UK tends to be ahead of the US on conversations of disability in theater because their history of disability theater is significantly older than ours, and they have one of, if not several, disability-specific conservatory programs, which we kind of don't in the US. So the distinct lack of commentary is quite odd to me, but I'm very likely just not looking in the right places. Also, side note, given the history, I think How to Dance in Ohio's UK transfer is going to do super, super well, and I'm stoked for it. But anyway, the 2009 Broadway run was nominated for 11 Tony Awards, winning 3 for orchestration, score, and Alice Ripley won for leading actress, and it also won the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for Drama, the 8th musical in its history to ever win that award, which is a very big deal because that award has only been around since 1910, and at this point, like as of 2024, only 10 musicals have received the Pulitzer, the most recent one before Next to Normal being Rent. The other cool thing about the show is the Twitter campaign, which I briefly mentioned earlier, where social media was a pretty new marketing tool at the time, and they turned the musical script into a series of tweets from different characters in the show, and 6 weeks into the run, serialized the show over the span of 35 days, which got tons of people interested in the show who otherwise wouldn't have been or didn't know about it, particularly in the more young and angsty demographic that felt most connected to this piece. And if you've been watching the series for a while, you've seen my Dear Evan Hansen video, and hopefully you can see the very strong connections between the creation and marketing of this show and how Dear Evan Hansen kind of replicated that for a semi-similar demographic less than a decade later. I think it's really interesting. They won an online media marketing and advertising award for this Twitter campaign. I unfortunately was not able to find this on the internet. I looked really hard. It doesn't seem to exist. There have been some famous productions of the show since the Broadway run, most notably the 2020 Kennedy Center production, also directed by Greif and featuring a lot of Dear Evan Hansen alumni. And then in 2023, the show had its London premiere at the Donmar Warehouse, later transferring to the West End, where it is currently running and got 4 Olivier nominations. And that's the current state of our show. So let's talk about disability narratives. Now, the primary theme that I keep coming to throughout this is that there isn't a lot of clarity, and where I think the show thought it was bringing up nuances in conversations, it didn't quite understand the more holistic, larger conversation enough to properly weigh the nuances against each other, so then it comes across a little bit more confused and muddly, but leaning more toward the harmful. Or there are situations where like a harmful thing is brought up for a long period of time, and then there's a very short handful of lines that say the not harmful side of it that doesn't actually balance out the harmful piece of it, because the harmful side that took more screen time or stage time had more emotion to it, and is a stronger part of the narrative, while the positive and non-harmful piece is just a small throwaway line that would be easily forgotten by an audience. And it makes me sad saying all this because, like, in all of the interviews with the creative team, I now see all of the ideas that they wanted to and meant to get across and thought they were narratively getting across, but then didn't quite succeed in doing so, or did in previous iterations, but then things changed and they didn't realize that now the piece by itself doesn't succeed in telling that specific story as well. But that's just how art boils down sometimes. You really cannot control how an audience sees and perceives a piece, no matter how much love and care and energy you put into it. And also, mental health specific representation is simply doomed from the start because of how quickly it ages, so that does not help. And rock musicals are also often doomed from the start for similar reasons, which we'll get into shortly. Now, the first thing that I noticed right off the bat is that there's clearly some sort of commentary around the concept of crazy as a social construct, or at least what exactly counts as crazy, that they point to by throwing around words such as crazy and insane and nuts very frequently. But that felt somewhat underdeveloped and unclear, especially because the flippant use of this language really only noticeably takes place in the first act. And also, it doesn't quite seem directed in what its purpose is when it's kind of thrown around. It felt more like they just put words relating to madness anywhere that they could because the show is about madness, rather than to make any definitive point about the use of that language. And I understood it a little bit more the second time through, but it still felt a little bit haphazard to me. Also, linguistic side quest for a second. Madness, mental illness, neurodivergence, mental disability, and psychosocial disability are all more or less synonyms, and I kind of use them interchangeably in this video, but they have different shades of meaning and they encompass slightly different concepts. So if you're like, what is Sydney talking about? Why are they using this word versus that one? That's why. My preferred term is madness, because that as a linguistic concept has been around longer than the linguistic concept of disability, so I feel it better reflects the fluidity and flexibility of who and what behavior is encompassed by that term socially and historically, and also kind of honors the people who came before us and makes it seem more like a concept that is neither clinical nor new, particularly because a lot of huge ableist talking points right now are like, neurodiversity is a new thing and people are too needy and blah 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 blah. And also every time that I use the word madness, people tend to get a little uncomfortable and start to question their own internalized ableism more than with the other terms that I use, in my experience at least. So that's the one I default to if you're like, what does that mean? That's what I'm referring to. But anyway, along with that unclear commentary on mad language in Act 1, which I think would have been more clear if they'd used it as much in Act 2, but it felt kind of like they were cramming all the crazy words they could into Act 1, and then after intermission they were like, well, we've made that point, let's just move on, which it wasn't really a clear point to begin with. And maybe it was clear and some of that language was meant to denote other things, and I just perked up to all of it because I'm a disability scholar. But it really gave off like a, hey, we haven't made it clear enough that Diana's mentally ill yet, so we're gonna sort of foreshadow it by saying crazy a lot, rather than like actually developing that out in her character's stage time. The script also made a lot of comparisons between different kinds of madness, which I don't think is incorrect, and that labels are fluid and the DSM concepts are very subjective and it's all within one category. But in comparing these things versus juxtaposing them against each other, you need to be consciously aware of what makes them different and what makes them the same, and I felt time and time again this show just kind of grouped all mental illness together as if they're interchangeable concepts. The first time that this happened is during Natalie's song, where she sings about how Mozart is crazy but also wrote music that makes a lot of sense, and I think part of this is an age poorly thing rather than an initial writing situation, so I'm very happy to be wrong here. But this is just the first one that stuck out the most to me. It's widely agreed upon that Mozart was most likely autistic and may have also had Tourette syndrome, and I had a hard time tracking down when this is initially formally spoken about, particularly because academic writing is usually behind cultural consciousness by anywhere from 5 to 10 years, often more in the disability community. I did find a 2007 academic article referencing it, so it seems like it was at least semi-discussed at this time. Unclear. It may have been more in the speculatory what diagnosis is it phase then, which in that case comparing his generic mental disability to Diana's bipolar makes more sense and just ages oddly, but at least to a modern viewer where Mozart as autistic has been commonly discussed since the mid-2010s, trying to create a link between the two things really felt a little confused to me. Kind of like if I were to make commentary about somebody with a prosthetic leg by telling a story about somebody with a facial difference. Like, they're in the same category and they definitely relate to each other, but if you use them as completely interchangeable concepts, it feels a little uninformed. I'm going to let that one slide. I think that's most probably just an aging situation, but the other bigger one is that Natalie and Henry as a couple exist as a reflection of a younger version, or rather next generation, of Diana and Dan, and there's something important about generational trauma here. But then in Natalie's trait profile, she's much more on the line of complex PTSD and or autism than on the bipolar side, and this could have been offset had they mentioned more of Diana's upbringing and what her mother is like, so we might see that maybe she grew up this way and it manifested into who she's become now, but that also wouldn't really work because they narratively drive home the fact that she wasn't majorly like this before Gabe's death, other than being called a free spirit, and that his death was the onset of her current mental state. So by their own framing, Natalie is not a manifestation of younger Diana and won't grow up to become her, not because the mom changes at the end and puts a stop to the generational trauma, but because it is a completely different situation. So seeing all of these different narrative pieces that sort of insinuate that Natalie might become her mom doesn't hit the way that it wants to because it's such a drastically different situation to begin with. There's also been some critique about Diana's diagnosis in particular being more of a throw every mental illness trait at the wall and see what sticks, but we'll call it bipolar because that covers a major chunk of the traits that we picked. The anti-DSM let's deconstruct diagnostic labels side of me wants to say, yeah, but there aren't firm lines between each condition, and frankly every single person's experience is super different anyway. But then also, as one of the first deliberate media portrayals of bipolar that was trying to more or less be seen as that, even if they weren't consciously aware of that fact, that that was the goal at the time, they did kind of have a responsibility to more closely fit the criteria that they chose to use, rather than pick and choose which traits of general madness fit the narrative that they wanted to tell. And I also think that this specific choice doesn't help them to get to the narrative goal that I think that they're aiming for, but we'll get to that. I'll also mention that one particular song that really shows the parallel between Natalie and Diana is Wish I Were Here, where it frames Diana's depersonalization related to the ECT that she's going through to help with her mental illness as similar to Natalie's depersonalization related to different drugs she's experimenting with. And there is a one-liner at the end of it how, like, oh, they're not interchangeable experiences, so it seems to somewhat be aware that that's an issue. But framing an entire 3-ish minute song around a problematic idea that tugs at the heartstrings of the audience versus, like, having one throwaway line that contradicts that idea does not mean that the issue of the previous thing is now negated. You can get away with showing more expansive nuance in theater than you can in film, because in film you're more likely to run the risk of people being on their phones and missing lines, or pausing it or walking away, or doing multiple things at once, because films are typically watched at home and often critiqued by, like, taking clips of them rather than looking at the holistic piece. And in the medium of theater you're more immersed in it, so there is less risk. And this is one of the reasons I prefer theater, because you have the freedom to make hotter takes and work through them in a way that would scare me in film, because critical thinking skills tend to be better when you're more immersed in a piece. But still, to bring in a completely different and very random example, if you have an entire musical where the core message of it is men like to wear dresses to pretend to be women in order to do nefarious things for 2.5 hours, but you spend 10 minutes of that runtime with one of them going, actually, I like wearing dresses. Maybe I want to stay this way, actually. That doesn't actually mean that you've subverted the man in a dress as a comedic bit and also lurking danger trope in a meaningful or helpful way, because the wider message is what's being absorbed, not that micro piece of it. And I very much feel the same with how the show is constructed as well. Diana also generally exists as a narrative prosthesis, and this gets a tiny bit better as the show goes on, but since she is initially framed in this light of this trope, it doesn't quite offset it enough to undo that view of her character, unless you're actively a media analyst and you're aware of the trope as it's initially set up and are trying to explain why it doesn't exist anymore, because I could argue why it doesn't exist anymore, but that's because I'm me. But somebody who's going into the show with no disability media knowledge is going to initially see her in this light because that's the trope that is set up, and then they're going to see it through the end this way because they're not used to actively deconstructing tropes while they're watching things. Narrative prosthesis as a concept was coined by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder in this book, Narrative Prosthesis, Disability, and the Dependencies of Discourse. It's a really good book, you should read it. And it basically refers to the concept of a disabled character being used to prop up the narrative of the people around them. So like, oh, I met a young cancer patient and it made me realize that life is short, and so now I'm going to change my entire life. That would be an example of a narrative prosthesis. A really common film trend is to name the film after the disabled character and say the film centers the disabled character, but the entire thing is actually about the caregivers around them and how their relationship to this disabled person changes them as people, and we get very little character exposition about the supposedly central character. And if we do, it's exclusively related to their disability. In fact, we just had another one of these show up in theaters in June for some reason. But for Diana, as the narrative prosthesis here, the story technically centers her, but it's primarily focused on the family unit and how they're impacted by her struggles. We get a song where Dan stands there waiting while she's in an appointment, singing about how hard it is to take care of her on him. We get several songs where Natalie's frustrated by how reality is, and the vast majority of Diana's songs are about being frustrated with her mind. And you could say, sure, the primary conflict of the show is her mental illness, and people do feel this way, so of course that would be the thing that they're all frustrated with. But because Diana is set up so that her only character trait is that she is mentally ill, and any other character trait she has is in direct relation to that mental illness, Diana becomes the physical embodiment of mental disability. So it goes from disabled personhood isn't complicated and flawed to disability is inherently bad and ruins the lives of everybody because it focuses primarily on the negative impacts, with the exception of the handful of times that it is used for comedic relief purposes in a way that also isn't my favorite. And this is tricky because, right, disabilities do have negative impacts on life. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that having 28 migraine days a month when I was younger was a positive thing for me or for the people around me to try to deal with. But that also doesn't mean that I was a burden. It doesn't mean that it became my only character trait and nothing else about me was interesting or worth learning about. And it doesn't mean that were that part of my life to be turned into some story or like film or show or whatever, that the stories of the people around me during that time are more valuable than my own personal lived experience and struggles and nuance, and that those people's stories would deserve more than maybe 10% of the overall screen time. Because sure, we can talk about how it affected my relationships, like I missed out on a lot of things because my friends at the time refused to make things accessible to me, but also meant that I knew my body better than anybody else that I knew, and I was asked for advice all the time. It meant I was a mom friend, I was always holding the friend group together and keeping things organized, and it meant that I was deliberate about where I spent my time and energy, which made me really focused on my passions at the time, and it also forced me to become really confident and comfortable in being different, which made me an interesting person. Obviously, struggling with bipolar is very different from struggling with chronic migraines, though a lot of the internalized ableism is quite similar. But what I'm trying to say is that there's so much more interesting stuff that we could have delved into with her character that would tone down the caregiver and burden narratives by like 80% and also made her as a character multi-dimensional. And that would actually better serve their goal of making a show about mental illness, because disability does impact every single corner of your life, and it changes how you see the world, and there are serious growing pains with that. But they never really portray how it affects her life outside of like, wow, she's in the hospital a lot. Meanwhile, we see how it affects Natalie's school and party life and Dan's work and sex life. Like, one thing we could look at is the fact that her profession is a stay-at-home mom right now, for example. Was this a choice from the beginning, or did she become too ill to be able to hold down a job, and so that's what ended up happening, but actually this newfound lack of direction and routine is making her struggle harder? Is this a yellow wallpaper situation? How could that be expanded upon to be more multifaceted and more nuanced? I actually do have some interesting yellow wallpaper related ideas, but we're going to save those for the ethical staging and script revision section. But the main point here is that we say the show is about Diana, but it's actually about how everybody around her is miserable because of the thing that she personally is struggling with, and it doesn't allow her to be a fully fleshed out person. There's also important discussion to be had about the sanitization of madness in the show to either deliberately or accidentally, by nature of the medium, make it more palatable to audiences. And if you want an even further in-depth breakdown of this, there's an article from Disability Studies Quarterly called Next to Normal and the Persistence of Pathology and Performances of Psychosocial Disability by Scott Wallen that I got a lot of these ideas from, so thank you to him for putting this together and kind of fleshing out my preliminary thoughts and solidifying them in a more organized and academic way. I will link that article near the top of my resources. You should go check it out. But the thing that I talked about earlier that makes Next to Normal so special and revolutionary is that it's really the first mainstream musical to discuss madness via the modern biomedical model. And the biomedical model at that time, it's now loosened up a little bit, but not a lot. It's more that the activist side of it has grown exponentially, was very of the mindset that we remove stigma around mental illness by treating it the same way that we treat physical illness, with a strong dichotomy of being sick versus being healed. And I distinctly remember learning about mental illness for the first time via this model when I was little, so this is very in line with the era that the show was written in. And this is just the curse of writing anything about mental disability, which is that it both ages horribly and at a speed that has never been before known to mankind. But this idea that mental illness and physical illness are the same thing is a flawed one, because it therefore paints psychology and psychiatry as fundamentally objective fields who have the utmost authority to decide what is normal and what is abnormal, and they are given the power to create normality and diagnose normality and abnormality because illness is bad and should be eradicated. It also frames madness as an individual issue that exists in your own personal brain and needs to be fixed, completely erasing the fact that perceived madness is fundamentally related to your environment, to your race, to your gender, to your class and social status, to your age, to your profession, to whether you are or are not conventionally attractive. All of these things factor in. And what is considered a normal level of slightly odd in the arts may be seen as clinically odd by somebody working in academics, and vice versa. What might be seen as cute and quirky behavior in a young white femme-presenting person like me may be seen as dangerous and in need of correction in a black man. It's very situationally dependent. And psychology and psychiatry have a huge hand in furthering oppression based on these metrics that are then considered objective because they are supposedly medical and scientific, despite science and medicine having always been deeply, deeply political. So any extra they get to decide who's crazy power, not maybe some power we want to be giving, because reminder that the original DSM was written by a singular dude, and that some studies suggest the DSM may be more unreliable in its ability to diagnose today than the random military conscription offices around the country were before the first DSM came along in 1952. And I'm not completely anti-medicalization. There is a gray area between the social model and the medical model that's actually practical for the society that we live in, and the fact that while being impaired does not mean that your life is any less worth living and isn't an inherently negative experience, some people may want to feel less impaired for various reasons, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, though the musical attempts to destigmatize psychosocial disability and champion understanding and support for individuals with such disability, the musical ignores how economic, institutional, political, and social factors interact to affect the status and well-being of such individuals. Through its simultaneous rejection and use of the concept normal, this well-meaning yet very narrow representation actually reinscribes ableist and normative ideologies that go unquestioned in our larger society. Some specific examples off the top of my head of explicitly ableist ideologies include the Berta narrative we talked about earlier, such as one of the family members calling her useless, Dan singing about remembering when she was 20 and brilliant and bold, which insinuates that now she's more mentally disabled, she's no longer brilliant. He also sings, I believe I would settle for one who can drive. And the script kind of carves out the person it deems as mentally well and what that should look like. Energized, sexually active, able to drive, not sad all the time, present, selfless, etc. And many of those things are just misogyny, but we'll get to that in a little bit. They also deliberately did do some things to remove stigma. Like book writer and lyricist Yorkie has said, there are people who suggested that we make Diana an artist, a creative person, but we chose to make her an ordinary woman. Not everybody who becomes a great artist has this disorder, and not everybody who has bipolar is creative. And composer Kit once mentioned that people wanted her sound to be somewhat kooky or dissonant, and he refused because that doesn't describe her character or all people with bipolar in general. But, and again, this is simply the trap of representation. In avoiding one trope, you end up falling into another trope. And so they end up creating their ordinary mentally ill character as white, rich, conventionally attractive, and married with a nuclear family, staged in a very clinical way that deliberately ignores wider societal impact. There's also the fact that staging madness is a completely different beast from what it looks like in real life versus what it looks like on film. There's actually different staging expectations between how madness is portrayed in plays versus how it is portrayed in musicals. And this is also a fairly recently discussed thing. I very much see this show as a huge piece of the trial and error that got us to the first major discussions around this concept. But part of the reason accidental madness is so ubiquitous in theater is because theater, especially musicals, is by definition over the top and an expansion of human traits. And our diagnostic criteria and social understandings of madness as they currently stand are pathologizing anything that is over the top in any direction. So at the very simplest, somebody who is too worried all the time comes across as anxious. Somebody who is too sad all the time comes across as depressed. Somebody who is too disconnected from the social world around them is autistic. Somebody who experiences a lot of energy sometimes and a lot of exhaustion other times is bipolar, etc. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that in practice and in real life, but this is how we get situations like those books where every character from Winnie the Pooh is described as a different DSM condition, because each character is meant to be an archetype of one particular thing. And in theater specifically, we get a lot of autistic coding because of how scripts are written mixed with the associated physicality of autistic people. And because of this phenomenon, every character on your stage is going to read as mad in some direction. And so creating a visibly mad character in the middle of all of that requires making it over the top. But if you make it over the top theatrically, that ends up completely sanitizing the uncomfortability around crazy behavior, and that tolerance level is much higher in theater, particularly musical theater, because the suspension of disbelief is so high. Like, Christopher Boone in Curious Incident the Musical would have been a completely different Christopher Boone than the one that we see in the play. And also, for the love of everything that is wonderful, do not ever turn Curious Incident into a musical. But back to the main point. Part of how Next Normal lets you know that the main character is crazy is not the physicality, it's not majorly the music, and it's not majorly the behavior. We'll get to that in a second. It's mostly just everybody continually informing you that Diana is crazy, which is part of why that language gets used so much in Act 1 and it dissipates in Act 2 because she is cured for a large section of Act 2. We're not uncomfortable with her hallucinating that her doctor's a rock star because it's played for laughs. And we also understand it's a hallucination because that's the proverbial sandbox that we know that we've been thrown into. This same type of staging has been used for other concepts in the past that don't denote madness, most notably the Dream Ballet. So we're already very comfortable with it. We're not uncomfortable with her hallucinating her son because we see him too. Most of her crazy behavior takes place off stage and in the past, where people mention it to her and then she goes, "Oh yeah, that must have been really hard on you," or "Oh yeah, that was wrong," and she seemed cognitively aware that those were mad things for her to have done. And whatever is mentioned there is mostly non-threatening and without impact. They're just brief one-liners. The only majorly irrational moment we see is at the beginning when she makes too many sandwiches, which, again, doesn't really have that much impact. And the only majorly uncomfortable things that come up are near the end when Natalie's explaining what she's afraid she might do in the future if she becomes crazy like her mom. I mean, even Diana's attempt at taking her own life is staged as a graceful, sad waltz. And that's complicated because there is significant research into the ethical and non-dangerous ways of showing that in media. I'm not entirely opposed to the staging choice. I think it's very interesting, but it does, again, end up being palatable and heartbreakingly beautiful rather than scary and uncomfortable as that topic is. Now, in the off-Broadway version, they had a song that was called Costco, where she goes into the store and she has a manic episode and she ends up buying like the entire store of things, and then they call her husband to come get her and he returns the things and brings her home. But this number is theatricalized and comedic, and so it doesn't actually feel that high consequence or disconcerting. It just simply feels silly and quirky and entertaining and like, oops, that's a little awkward. It honestly reminds me a lot of When He Sees Me from Waitress, which doesn't denote madness as a song. And I don't think portrayals of madness, and specifically psychosis, which is one of the, if not the most stigmatized pieces of madness, need to always feel uncomfortable. But I think the show wanted to make them feel uncomfortable and then didn't succeed in that. But then people who see the show feel like they've seen the worst of mental illness in this show, so they get it now, when that's simply not the case because the stigma of race isn't involved here, the stigma of disorganized speech isn't involved here, the stigma of houselessness, the stigma of struggles with personal hygiene, all of these things are not here. In an effort to avoid stigma, the show thus uses strategies that exemplify a catch-22 people with psychosocial disabilities who wish to advocate for themselves face. In order to claim that badness is acceptable and natural, advocates often rely on perspectives about what is normal that have the effect of disempowering the very people they are advocating for. It's very much a, we will make this less scary and overwhelming so you can get comfortable with it, but in doing so we accidentally put down other people in this group who also need support. Kind of in the same way that like most autistic representation focuses on how autistic people are very logical and predictable, so you just have to learn how we work, when in fact many autistic people are quite unpredictable and quite chaotic, and solely having the hyper-organized autistics as the representation available ends up harming the already more stigmatized people in our community, which is hard and it's complicated and really can only be fixed by having lots of different kinds of representation available. But going back to the staging for a moment, the original staging and what I've seen of the UK staging feels very Ibsen's The Doll's House to me, which tying that in with it also feeling like the yellow wallpaper, maybe a little bit of Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique, it made me crave some sort of commentary on gender or household dynamics more specifically, because we have this cultural understanding around household stories where the woman is stuck at home all the time and portrayed as crazy while characters come in and out around her, but then you become unsure if she's actually crazy or everybody else around her is creating this reality for her and then she breaks out of it. And I felt like this show sort of initially planned to follow that plot because it has all of the it has the backbone of that plot in it, and it has a handful of ideas around like men being the ones pushing her to do these treatments that she's afraid to do or that are negatively impacting her quality of life. The idea of both her and her husband struggling with grief and hers being pathologized when his is not, but I also think the psychosis aspects kind of overshadow this message, but at this point were they to take out the psychosis, it would be erasure, so that's complicated. And also at the end when she says what doctors call dysfunction we tried to call romance and leaves him, so it had this underlying conversation that maybe her madness is caused by the situation around her rather than the madness causing the situation. And the fact that her craziness is mostly denoted by everybody else saying that she is crazy rather than her showing that she's crazy brings that even more into question. But the other half of the show is so focused on the medicine of it and her coming to terms with the fact that her brain is different and she has to learn how to work with that, along with showing how kind and caring the husband is and genuinely wants to support her and holds her and stays with her through everything. And I think those two ideas could definitely have coexisted in the same piece cohesively, but it would therefore need some commentary around gender and the societal expectations of badness. It would also have needed to either tone down or reframe that badness, and it would have needed to frame Dan as more of an accidental abuser. And we're going to talk about further thoughts on that in a bit. I don't want to get ahead of myself. What's most interesting to me, and this is kind of my last disability narrative point, is that the creative team talked in several interviews about how important medical accuracy is to them and how they had several doctors look over the script to make sure they got all the medical information right, which I think is super awesome, but it does show an interesting divide between medical knowledge and narrative knowledge, if that makes sense. Like, factually, most of what happens in the show, there's some liberties that have been discussed in medical circles, is correct, and therefore, technically, shouldn't cause harm because it's factually correct. But tonally and narratively, it ends up using that factual information in a deeply irresponsible way that actually causes a lot of harm. And those narrative ideas come from a mix of what medicine was saying about mental illness at the time that just doesn't age well, but also what the theater industry says about madness in general. And in fact, this show, more than anything else I've analyzed thus far, perfectly explains how the theater community tends to handle the concept of mental disability, which is that if it's really bad, maybe you should fix it, but also you should learn how to live with it as it is because you don't want doctors messing with your head and it'll ruin your creativity, and that's how you become the best version of yourself, which usually gets turned into like, see how you can turn your pain into cool art because that's what makes you a good artist, rather than like, you deserve to feel the way that you want to in order to be the best version of you that you can be and create work that you're proud of and not want to die all the time, because fun fact, artists make art when they're happy and when they're miserable, and in fact, studies have shown they make more and better art when they're not miserable, and they live longer to make more art. I really just need the tortured artist trope to go away, and I especially need it to get its way out of the education system because it's causing significant harm. But that's the other side of my job. My major question on accuracy throughout researching the show is, how did we get here? And maybe I missed something, but everybody's like acting like this is the very worst that she's ever been by far. They never really dealt with anything like this before, even though she was diagnosed 16 years ago. So the fact that she doesn't seem to be in consistent talk therapy at this point and doesn't seem to have consistent care ideas, and her family doesn't have care ideas beyond medication at this point, is very bizarre to me, because the combination of therapy, medication as treatment has been a thing for quite some time. Like, if the show took place in the 1950s or 60s and it was just like, we're just putting her on drugs and leaving it, that would change and I would be interested in that conversation. Again, it would need more gender, but whatever. But in 2008, this is just standard care. And I'm not saying that she can't still struggle after 16 years, like, mental illness is a lifelong thing, but I had a hard time understanding why, aside from the fact that narratively it needed to be 16 years, and narratively they needed to describe to the audience what was happening like it's the first time that they've heard of it, because for the audience it probably is, her level of struggling mixed with her absolute lack of support is still the case after this period of time. My first guess would be that she was stable for a really long time and then her meds suddenly stopped working, and so they're scrambling because she's been stable for so long. Like, some SSRIs simply just stop working after an extended period of time. I know that SSRIs are not her primary medication, though it is mentioned in the show. The research on whether this happens with other medications like the antipsychotics that she's on is more unclear, but at the very least, I don't understand why she hasn't been working on other coping mechanisms in therapy. And also, if it were the case that she was stable for so long and now she's suddenly not stable, which would make sense that she therefore doesn't have a care plan because they're not used to having a care plan. Like, I had really bad migraines for a while and then I stopped having them for a long period of time, and then I had like 2 months where I had them really bad again, and I was like, I don't know how to deal with this anymore because I completely forgot. So like, that happens. But then the way that that Natalie and her dad talk to each other about it, it seems like this has been a consistent problem for their entire lives, so then that doesn't actually narratively line up. And it's also important to note that bipolar typically onsets during somebody's teens, and if it is caused by a traumatic event, that event typically isn't a grief. Major depressive disorder with psychotic features as triggered by the death of a son might actually make more diagnostic sense to use here for a number of reasons. They also lean very hard on the idea that bipolar is genetic, but then if it were genetic bipolar, it would have most likely likely onset during her teens, which would, again, hopefully give her slightly better coping situation than she currently has. And I know that this is a very broad brush and everybody's experiences are super different, and this reality could technically be true for somebody. But when turning something into media meant to educate somebody about a fairly common issue and kind of being the first piece to ever do that, there is a responsibility to represent it in one of the more typically presenting ways, at least at first, so that it doesn't create significant misinformation, which they simply could have done by making it undiagnosed bipolar that wreaked havoc on the family, and she finally gets diagnosed now and works on getting help now. And Yorkie mentioned in an interview that they wanted to center the story around the fact that the best medicine and the best intentions can't always cure mental illness, but instead of framing that as like, this is complicated, it ends up coming across as both psychiatrists are the only ones who know what crazy actually is, and also that psychiatrists don't really know anything and are guessing widely, and that often treatment is worse than the illness at hand, which is dangerous and irresponsible. They frame the process of trial and error because medications and treatment work differently for everybody as lack of scientific knowledge. They frame medications as inherently bad things, and that doctors like to keep you drugged and numb because that's what keeps you stable, and that the meds don't really work. And also the ECT thing. We'll get to the ECT thing. But this leads people to leave the theater less thinking, oh, not all treatment works for all people, which is the case, and more skeptical and or afraid of the medical establishment, or at least the mental health care side of it. And I know that it's a bit odd to hear me defend the psychiatric side of the medical establishment like this, because it has a lot of ableist issues and causes a whole heck of a lot of harm, and I do think that we need to have more acknowledgement that, like, these are things that we're going to live with for the rest of our lives, and we need to learn how to work with them instead of fighting them and working against them. But also, the medical system is an important thing that does important things at the same time, and reforming that system and working to tailor your specific medical care to your needs, even if that's not entirely possible, is definitely by far a better option than just completely avoiding care altogether. And also, going off of your meds can be very dangerous, not just in like a, oh, you may relapse in your mental illness kind of way, but also like, that's a huge physiological change for your body and can wreak serious havoc. And the fact that Diana can just flush her medication and then feels completely fine is concerning, and I get that she's in a manic episode directly after this, so she may not even technically notice she's in pain or having physiological symptoms, but when weighing reality versus safety of narrative, I would always lean more toward the safety of narrative, and I think that this definitely should have. And speaking of safety of narrative, perhaps the biggest critique the show has had from the very beginning is how it handles ECT and what the audience leaves thinking about this treatment. Particularly that it's super extreme, it's super experimental, it completely destroys your memory, and then the fact that she's being pressured into it by her doctor makes it feel even more sketchy and unethical. Now, the first thing to address is that ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, is not experimental. It was created in the 1930s in Italy, and it wreaked a lot of havoc at that point because it seemed to be helping some patients, but also the way ECT works is that it uses electric pulses to trigger tiny seizures in the brain, and at the time they used neither anesthesia nor muscle relaxants, so people were getting very hurt, and it was a very bad time, and it was kind of torture. Not just kind of, it was torture. And at that point, it was very much experimental. But it became majorly modified in the 1950s and 1960s with the addition of anesthesia and muscle relaxers. So side effects went from, you know, broken teeth and whiplash and everything else to light headaches, stiffness, and mild confusion. There was a switch to a different type of electrical current in the 60s and 70s that significantly reduced side effects. And then around 2007-ish, there was another switch which further reduced memory-specific side effects. This treatment has been highly controversial since the beginning, and so many discussions of it on either side are very aggressively trying hard to debunk all the misinformation, or they're actively fear-mongering in the other direction. But there's a significant amount of positive research about the impacts of it, and the scientific field is still rapidly doing further research on how to make it more effective and understand the mechanisms at play a little bit more. Now, from my understanding, kind of wading through bias on either side of this argument, it seems to be remarkably effective for patients in the short term, but the effects are not always permanent. However, even if it alone doesn't work forever, having that initial drastic shift for many people gets them out of pure survival mode, which gives them space to be able to develop coping mechanisms and work on other treatment choices as well to get them where they want to be in the long term. Now, the memory discussion is even more complicated because it's very hard to measure memory to begin with, so you can't quite tell how much it changes, but also depression itself causes significant memory dysfunction, so people, after suddenly not feeling high levels of depression, may feel like the ECT has caused them to lose massive chunks of time from the past, but they very well may have actually lost that information due to the severity of their depression. And mania. I believe mania also similarly messes with memory. It also seems like if a memory deficit occurs after the treatment, it typically gets better within a few months, and often tests on memory actually improve after ECT because the depression is significantly better, and also the rates of this have gotten even better just since around the time that this show is written because of the changes in the standards of care. And brief sidebar about memory loss, I chose not to talk about these memory loss narratives in this breakdown because it's complicated, mainly that we know less about memory than we like to think that we do, and it's one of those situations where there are definitely patterns of ways things likely might go, but also literally who knows, because brains do weird things and anything can happen. But I do think the memory loss they chose to show for her character was way over the top in comparison to what any actual ECT side effect might look like, because it would be a lot more like, I can't recall that, here's a thing to remind you, oh my goodness, yes, absolutely, followed by a stream of memories, not I don't know what my home is or who my daughter is, primarily because of how her memory would have actively been affected, especially because of depression or mania, in addition to the potential ECT side effect. And I get narratively why they decided to go with the treatment wiped her clean entirely, because it furthers the not all treatments work for everybody, and the whole feeling and remembering pain is part of being a person theme. It also increases the stakes of the show, like it increases the drama. I get that, I understand that. And my memory loss is different and also a lot better now, but it was functionally somewhat related to what she would have been experiencing from her mental illnesses. And for me, it was more like facts I'd forgotten, or events or conversations or something I didn't have access to, but are semi-easily brought back with the right external marker, and things that I semi-remember, but they're just snapshots or slow-moving dreams or otherwise things that don't feel like reality, and I won't decide actually genuinely happened unless somebody tells me that they actually genuinely happened. And like, yes, I have forgotten people, absolutely, but those are usually people I only met maybe twice in a particularly foggy window of time. So it doesn't seem logical to me that she would completely forget things or people that have been in her life for over a decade with this particular kind of memory loss. If it were a dementia or a Alzheimer's situation, that's a different discussion, but that's not what this kind of memory loss is. The way that Natalie shows her photos and things come flooding back feels completely accurate to my experiences, but the fact that she went from like, who is Natalie, to, oh yeah, I did do this thing at your swim meet that one time in a very short window of time is quite weird to me, specifically given the memory loss that she would have in this thing. Like, yes, memory comes back exponentially because things are interconnected, so the more connections you make, the more connection each connection is going to make, but it's not that clean and it's not that fast. And again, this idea of ECT being experimental and then completely wiping her memory is quite dangerous because it makes people afraid to do this well-researched treatment option that may be quite helpful for them. And a lot of people love the show because they see themselves represented in it, so sharing this aggressively anti-ECT message can have serious negative impact. It's also interesting to me because in one interview, Yorkie talked about how important ECT is as a treatment, so I'm not sure how that became this, which again ties into the discussion earlier around things being medically accurate, but the tone of that accuracy making it harmful anyway. The one other thing to add about ECT is that we only see it as more extreme and like a last resort because the majority of US insurance companies require patients try antidepressants first before it's willing to cover ECT treatments because I think they're more expensive, so that's literally the primary reason. And this is another case in the show where they said all of the narratively good things, like they talked about the recovery rate and how it's fairly safe, but then they followed it up with a ton of things that completely emotionally contradict that and therefore make the narrative harmful, which is frustrating because they have all the pieces to work with. They're all right there. I just feel like the emphasis was put onto the wrong pieces. And now the next step from here is to figure out how one might ethically stage the show given everything that we just discussed. And I think if there's anything, I would try to keep it as grounded and untheatrical as possible, particularly because the over-the-top theatricality of it sort of dilutes the madness by making it seem more on the fun, campy, quirky side, and also making her more similar to the other characters in behavior, and it feels more like the script is telling you she's different, when in reality she isn't that different from everyone else, because everybody is in this over-the-top theatrical personhood. I also think really hammering home that it is a period piece and not a current day situation. However, I feel like most of us still think it's 2015 in their brain, so I don't think that's gonna overall majorly help anything. But overall, I think this might be the first show in the series where I say that I actually don't think there's a way to ethically stage it at this point. Well, I did say that with Dear Evan Hansen, so I guess this is the second time that I'm going to say that. Because the thing that worked with Next to Normal originally was the rock musical concept, which we talked about with Tommy, where rock as a medium exists to simply bring up really hard taboo stuff that people don't really talk about, and then they jam out and they feel angsty about it, and they get out all the big feelings, and then the actual dealing with the problems that comes after that is sidelined to be a later problem. And so rock musicals, in the precise social climate they're created, work really well because they deliberately poke the thing that everybody's thinking about but refuses to put into words and starts a conversation. But they then age really terribly because once that really tough thing nobody talks about anymore gets talked about very frequently, the fact that a rock musical simply brought up a topic and then didn't bother to address it or handle it properly becomes really painfully obvious and really easily critiqued, because it should be critiqued. Because simply bringing something up and not majorly handling it properly or discussing it, while we can hope an audience might then educate themselves or work off of that, it more frequently just creates space for everybody's wider biases and stereotypes to fill in the rest of those gaps. And yes, now more people are talking about the thing, but they're more uneducated about that thing and feel like they are educated about that thing and feel like they've done the work when they haven't. So then the question is that situation actually better because we now have space to work on correcting that narrative, or is it worse because we have further embedded harmful narratives? And that I don't know. I personally lean more toward the second one, because why not have the first mainstream conversation about an issue like that also be super well informed and in depth at the same time? Like, why do we culturally really only react when rock musicals, or now pop musicals more than rock musicals as genres change, are the ones to start these conversations? Because that's really weird to me, and I don't get why we can't just have both things at the same time. But back to Next to Normal specifically. Because of this, while the show had critiques around its storytelling and ethics and all of that good stuff at the time it was written, it did kick down a door, which is super important. And at the same time, now that the door has been kicked down, while we don't have a massive ton more mental health content on the musical side of theater now than we did before, we still have a good deal of stuff that is more responsibly handled and less harmful that built on this foundation. And I think maybe it's time to say, hey, thanks for everything, and put it into the archive, which is hard because I know how deeply important the show is to a lot of people, and so they want to see it again and again. And again, this show is currently very financially viable, so it's not going away anytime soon, but I don't see a universe where this particular script is one that we should keep working with without some major either script changes or clear caveats as to the issues with it and discussions around it, because it is so time period specific, and yet nobody sees it as a period piece because the time is so recent in our collective memory. And to clarify, I'm not saying we pretend the show never existed, because that's a terrible idea from a historian perspective, but I think, if anything, it gets a revival in 30 to 40 years when it will feel like a deeply problematic period piece. That's a fun time, but also that's what happened with Tommy, and people don't seem to be picking up that it's an issue either, so I don't know. But the general message I'm trying to get across is that the narratives in the show were irresponsible at the time, but I can sort of somewhat kind of let it slide because it started a conversation around mental health in theater. And also that 16 years later, they're exponentially more irresponsible because of how these conversations have changed in media over that time period, and no longer have the buffer of, hey, at least we're talking about it for once to save it. And that it's a period piece, but nobody sees it that way, so it being staged as is in the modern day is actively setting us back in several different directions. Now, if I had the chance to change the script, I think the first thing would be to clarify what the main message of it is. Is it about the flaws in the medical system? Is it about how we over-pathologize grief? Or how we police women? Or how unhealthy environments create madness? Are we framing madness as a chronic illness or as a sudden onset event? Are we framing it as scary and life-ruining, or as a semi-natural human variation and the messiness of humanity? And I think that more than one of these ideas can coexist. It just felt to me like the show itself wasn't entirely sure what precise statement it wanted to make beyond mental illness impacts families and life is hard and messy, but trying your best, not ignoring your problems is what matters. And if they'd been more solid on what sort of thesis they were making, that would give the freedom to point out the flaws in that thesis throughout as like little counterpoints, rather than a plot that kind of meanders around different somewhat haphazard points, which is what it feels like to me right now. Some things that I think could aid in this would be making the medical establishment a bit more personal. I would love it if the two of them distrust doctors because the doctors missed what was wrong with their son, and that's why Gabe died, because that's what happened in the show. But making their fear of various treatments and various judgments of doctors focused on their own medical trauma and therefore overall distrust of the system. I think that'd be fantastic. It would make a good commentary on treatment and the medical system, and it would feel more realistic to a lot of people who've been through the medical system, and it would also make the medical system seem less seemingly objective when it was never meant to be objective, and it is not objective. I also think cleaning up her diagnostic situation and what that actually is would be helpful, particularly focusing more on the grief and how depression looks like a lot of different things. I think at this point the psychosis cannot be removed from the show because it does already exist in the piece and in the cultural consciousness around the piece, and so that would become an erasure situation. But any narrative about pathologizing grief, and more specifically pathologizing how women grieve, is really hindered by the heavy focus on the psychosis and the hallucinations. I would also include more stigmatized sides of madness, like disorganized speech and behavior, slurred speech, lethargy, struggles with personal hygiene, all of those things. If you really want to dig into the commentary around stigma and disability and how we pathologize things in some people and not others, making Diana a person of color would also help the piece a lot. You'd have to rewrite most of the script, but it would be interesting. I think that would be cool. Another thing around the realm of environment creates madness, not just the brain, as well as like unpacking this burden narrative, would be playing with a husband, as I briefly mentioned earlier, where he becomes an accidental abuser, like somebody with a whole ton of internalized ableism that they haven't dealt with, and so they think they're helping their partner with their struggles, but in reality are pushing them beyond their limits. They're not respecting consent or boundaries, and they're making them do things they're not comfortable doing or struggle to do to an unsafe degree. But then that's usually not clocked by people in the partner's life because everybody sees that as like, oh, they're getting better in an able normativity sense, and don't realize the partner's not being listened to, they're not being allowed to make choices for themselves, that somebody else has taken away all of their autonomy, all of that kind of stuff. Because this is a really, really common type of medical abuse and domestic violence in the disabled community, and I have always wanted to see that narrative explored in media, and I never have. Other than the occasional, like, stop trying to force me to be who I'm not narrative that exists, but that's a completely different emotional depth than this situation would be. And in this show, that sort of turn would better explain why she walks out on him in the end. And I think they sort of tried to do this when he talked her into doing the ECT, which she was scared about doing, and then they walked it back by how kind and good he was with her during that memory loss time, and he sings Why Stay about how he'll always stay by her side. And I think if they leaned harder into the he means well, but he's actually dealing with his own stuff through her in an unhealthy way that's causing more harm than good for both of them, toxicity, this would then frame his songs about her being a burden and him wishing she were abled as slightly more hollow to an audience, which would fix a lot of the narrative harm there. And we already have some semblance of this with how he doesn't realize she's in that manic episode and not on her medications anymore in Act 1, or how she says completely reasonable things in the first 2 numbers and he keeps commenting on how he never knows what she's talking about. There are already many moments throughout the show where he's dictating that she is crazy when the behavior that she's doing isn't actually crazy, but then he's still framed as a slightly messy yet more sane and centered as the reasonable character. So then we trust what he has to say about her mental state more than we trust her to talk about her own mental state. And if we played with that to show that you can love and care about somebody and think you're doing the right things, but also actually cause a ton of further harm, I think that would be super interesting. And in regards to how staging the psychosis as is feels theatrical and feels sanitized and needs to be a little bit more uncomfortable and different from the people around her to actually aid the narrative, mixed with that abuse idea, I think it would be really interesting if the show just decided to go full yellow wallpaper with it. Well, okay, my first thought is, why can't Gabe just be a ghost and not be a hallucination? Because that would fix a lot of things. But yellow wallpaper idea. If you're familiar with this story at all, I brought it up a lot in this video already, so I have a video about it. It's probably already been linked in a card somewhere. But basically, it's a short story that is diary entries from a woman who's going through a supposed cure for her mental illness in the 1800s that involves doing literally nothing and laying in bed all day, and she, over time, from this isolation and lack of anything to do, becomes convinced that there is a woman living in the wallpaper that needs help escaping. And it's very unclear to the reader whether or not this woman is real. And while the author was a disgusting, racist, ableist woman, that's beside the point. I think it'd be super interesting if the show decided to handle psychosis that way and make it viscerally unclear to the audience whether or not anything that's happening is real or not, but at the same time, you don't care because you know the way that she's being treated by the people around her is making the situation worse, and you want her out of there. And I have not a single clue how a concept like that could play on stage, but I think letting the audience descend into madness with her in a way, which it did start to do with Hallucination Gabe, and then it pivoted in direction, would have been a very, very fascinating choice, and it would have gotten rid of most of the burden narrative because it would then become a deliberate choice by everybody else on that stage to view her as a burden rather than further help her or just understand that we live in a world where everybody's interdependent and we really only criticize it when it's a marginalized person who needs to be interdependent. And it would also really aggressively center Diana in her own story and let her control it and let the audience go through it via her mind rather than the situation that we currently have. So that's my big brain idea. That at this point is a completely different musical, but it would be really cool. I don't know, the show's really complicated, but I think that might be an interesting thing to think about. I don't even know if that idea with the current script as it exists would be possible. Like if there's a way to like really reinvent the staging of it. I don't know. Anyway, I feel bad about this analysis in particular, even though I definitely went harder on Tommy, but I cannot emphasize enough how important this show was historically to start the conversation and to make these mistakes so we could then build on it to handle mental illness. Not always better, but at least occasionally better. And that is why there is so much to be critiqued from the show, because we've seen other things build on these ideas since then, and that's what gives us so much to talk about. And I think there's something really cool about the fact that we've come so far since 2008 for this to be that outdated. It's really common in the author side of the disability community for people to include something in the realm of, I hope you can look back at this and say it's outdated, in their introduction or their author's note to whatever they write. Because we, as media creators, as people who've watched our history grow and change exponentially, and we want it to continue to do so in the future, and we're nearly honored to have been a part of it at some point. So hopefully this show can be looked at through the same lens and that these creators can look at the show through that lens because they very much deserve to. Now this does get a lot less cute and a lot more concerning when we get into the fact that then these deeply outdated things are being staged at complete face value with no caveats or acknowledgements of how outdated they are, but my original point still stands. Either way, I hope you learned something today. My next dramaturgy project is going to be Violet, I think, and I'm going to vlog the entire research process so you can see how I put these things together, because I thought that might be fun and interesting. Also, as of the time that you are seeing this, I will have officially started a Patreon, which will be linked in the description if you want to see my videos up to a month early, and send some support my way. I would really appreciate it. You're also welcome to like, subscribe, comment, share, do whatever sparks joy and feels right for you, but absolutely no pressure. And as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.